Hi, this is. I guess you're so excited too. It's like, yes, it's recording. All right, guys, welcome back to our second question and answer. I guess it's a series now. We have a guest with us, world-renowned macro coach. Right? Did I get that right?
Macro coach Brian Miner.
He does macros. I do micros. And we're combining our powers today to go through the questions that I asked from you guys on Instagram. Again, thank you everyone who participated. We picked the ones that we thought yielded the most interesting answers, and then also, of course, the ones that also, I guess, would help everyone out there, or that most of us, or at least you could say we've all dealt with it at one point or another. Yeah, let's get this rolling. Brian,
So
first one.
Yeah, we won't go in any particular order. We'll kind of just tackle them randomly. So this one from 200 to lose, it says, do you take anything for joint support? Just recommend rest when joints are sore. I don't personally take anything for joint support. I take fish oil, which has some benefits in that regard, but I think a lot of people focus more on the output side of the equation rather than thinking about what they can do to minimize that trauma to begin with. And I think for me, it comes down to time. If I put in the time to warm up properly and do some dynamic work before I squat, then the downstream effects in subsequent days seem to be attenuated for the most part. So there's nothing that you're going to take in a bottle that's going to fix joints that are aching through a long training cycle.
Yeah. So no, I agree with that. You have to, I think, firstly look at what's going on in here in the weight room, and then often I think sometimes also you have to look at your program design. I think I've had a few, looking back now, a few setups that when you think about it, and I think Smoloff is one that we've seen before. Almost everyone who does that. I don't care how much glucosamine the fish oil you're ODing on, you might end up limping afterwards.
Yeah.
Totally.
And that's that particular program too. It's typically volume and intensity are inversely related, and that's just a linear kind of progression in both regards. So I think just being smart and proactive on the front end of things goes a long way there. Let's see. When designing an off-season program, is volume completely individual? Are there rules of thumb for assigning sets and rep schemes, and do they change if we utilize RPE versus percentages? You want to kick that one?
No, kick this one.
So, yes, the first part of your question, is it individual? It's very individual. The longer you've been training, the deeper into your training career, the more work you're going to need to do, and that's going to vary person to person. I mean, somebody that's been training, for 10 years might need more volume than someone else that's been training for 10 years, and so it's very individual, even in a relative sense there. But sort of the common rule of thumb, I think, is to start off with what you can get away with. Don't start doing Smolov, for example, after you've only been, doing the row split, so to speak, and go from squatting once a week or even twice a week to squatting 4 times a week. It doesn't need to. I think as bodybuilders and powerlifters, we tend to think in terms of more is better, and it's easy to fall into that trap. And I think it's a good thing that people are starting to catch on that volume drives these adaptations, but they think, okay, that means the more volume, the better. So see what you can get away with. Know that you're going to have to do more work over time. And then, you want to tackle the second part of that one? Rules of thumb for assigning sets and rep schemes, and do they change if we utilize RPE versus percentages?
Go with that one, and I'll finish it off, because I think...
So I think it depends on what your goal is. Sort of backing into that question, does it change if we utilize RPE versus percentages? Not depending on, they're both attacking the same thing, and that's prescribing intensity. So if you say you were doing a daily undulating pattern on squats, 10-8-6, like in a volume block. That could be at 60%, 65%, and 70%, or it could be across the board like a 7 RPE for each of those days. And so that's going to vary person to person, but all RPE is trying to do is, or a percentage is trying to do is make a load feel a certain difficulty, to create a desired adaptation. And that's what RPE directly gets at. And so the second part of that question are the rules of thumb for assigning sets and rep schemes. They don't change if it's RPE versus percentages. They're both getting at the same thing, but assigning sets and rep schemes, it does depend on what your intent is of that particular mesocycle or period of the annual plan. If you're in a volume block, obviously you're gonna want to cater those rep schemes in a manner that's accommodating for accumulating volume without killing yourself with a ton of high intensity work set after set. And so there's lots of ways to go about doing that, but yeah, I guess when I set up a training block, I try to take time in the gym into account, and if the goal is accumulating volume, the main goal isn't maximizing low rep strength, then I tend to utilize those higher rep ranges even with a power lifter. I mean, it's sets of 10, they suck, but they're gonna they definitely have their place in that regard.
And one thing we brought up, we were talking about this, is for some people, or almost the majority of people, and it depends on how patient you want to be with this, I think having assigned percentages might be better than going purely based on RPE. I definitely think if you can, change your loads on a daily basis, be more dynamic with your programming, I really think over the long run that's going to yield better results. But I just think the majority of people just aren't ready for that.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, I know there's, as much as I'm not super advanced in terms of my overall training career, I plan to be lifting well into my 60s, hopefully, but at the same time, it takes a lot of time to really master RPE, and you really sort of have to check your ego at the door and be able to assess that accurately. That probably.
It's a great question.
Yeah, that is, and that's actually a good segue into the RTS question. So, what is your opinion on Mike Teixeira's RTS? Used to use a lot of his principles in regards to having an objective measure of autoregulation. Has your opinion on fully autoregulated programming changed, and why did you stop using principles like fatigue stops to autoregulate volume?
Okay. Well, initially I stopped using them in the middle of my last contest prep, and the main reason was because sometimes I think, especially when you're prepping and you're really close to your contest weight, you just don't feel like training quite often. So it's really hard to be objective with what training load you should use for the day. And there was many days where I remember there was things that Ben wrote up on the spreadsheet that Ben from De Novo Nutrition, that I was like, there's no freaking way I'm gonna make it through this today, but I did. So that was where I kind of switched, and I've stuck with that. I think even more so now, where coming back from a few minor setbacks, injuries, and I think giving myself assigned loads lets me cater to the long term, which I think priority number one right now is get healthy. And it's really hard because there's some days when I go in and I'm like, I can have a really good day. I can add 50 pounds to this 5-rep set, but it just isn't the smart thing to do. Brian here, actually, you ran an RTS type program.
Yeah,
nationals.
Yeah, and I worked with Mike Teixeira leading into nationals last year, and I do enjoy it. When I was working with him, I wasn't using fatigue stops. I would do a prescribed back off percentage with a number of sets essentially assigned to that back off. And one thing that I'm actually a fan of doing that, because I've noticed, except for really advanced lifters, it's hard to really assess and have the perfect environment to make that method work as optimally as it can. So, for example, I noticed when I was using fatigue stops, I was using fatigue stops, my rest intervals on my back off sets would sometimes be variable a little bit. So that drastically changes things in terms of overall volume. I mean, if I get an important phone call halfway through my workout that's an emergency, for example, and I have to attend to that, then I might be able to come back and knock out 2 more sets than I would have had I not gotten that. And so by having the prescribed back off sets, it allowed me personally to progress volume in a more predictable manner. And I think with the fatigue stops, it's certainly a good way to auto-regulate volume, but it has to be in the right circumstance, I think. So
yeah, and I used fatigue stops too, but at the same time I had a cap. Because just based on my training history, you know, a little bit more volume based, I was able to, you know, I could tolerate more sets at 80% than, you know, someone who has been purely a powerlifter their whole life. So that definitely helped me, because there were certain days where, you know, I'm like, here I am digging myself a hole on Monday, and I have to do this again on Wednesday. Yeah. So yeah, no, I think for a minute there, it was definitely my flavor of the week, and I do think when I'm back at 100%, I'm definitely going to run some auto-regulated blocks, because I've had some pretty good success with that approach.
And last thing to touch on here is, you know, the fatigue stops is a way to auto-regulate volume efficiently, but if you're using RPE, you're still going to be indirectly auto-regulating volume just based on the load you're lifting for the total reps. So if you're weaker that day, you're still going to be lifting less weight and accumulating less volume. So it's not the most efficient way to do it, but it is still occurring in that regard. Let's see. Top tips to preserve muscle mass when one hasn't been lifting due to injury for over 1 month. So I actually had a pretty bad groin strain right after Nationals, and that was in July, and I essentially had to take about 6 months off completely from squatting, and I ended up getting PRP, which is platelet-rich plasma therapy, on both sides of my, you know, where the tendon inserts, and it was extremely painful, but it definitely, I believe that it played a large role in my recovery. But point being is that was a long period of time without training directly, providing that stimulus. And one of the biggest factors, I think, is I wasn't in a caloric deficit. I think that's a lot of people that are trying to overcome an injury at the same time, maybe they want to get leaner. And I think, as coaches, we've both probably had athletes that have, they want to get that spring break body, but they also have a nagging injury that they're trying to work around. And so it's not the most efficient way to go about doing that. So my advice, primary piece of advice is, first of all, don't train on it to make it worse. And second, don't be in a deficit.
Yeah. And I think that's something a lot of lifters do when obviously you aren't in a position where you can gain muscle because you're hurt. A lot of folks try to cut down, to do something, I guess, in the meantime. But that I know from personal experience. I had an injury happen to me in the middle of my contest prep, and it was quite significant, the difference just 1 month after the diet. Basically, the progress I had made on that injury, the 4 months where I was in a caloric deficit and trying to train through it, which was a big mistake as well. Didn't make much progress at all, and then within 1 month of eating, it was quite ridiculous, the difference. So yeah, and again, all in context, I'm assuming that you're injured to the point where you can't train at all, because in your case, you were able to do upper body and do what you could. You could deadlift too.
Yeah, I was able to conventional deadlift. actually sumo deadlifts.
Yeah, yeah. So if you are in a position where you can train at all, I think at some point everyone try hard enough, do this long enough.
Yeah.
That will happen. It's really just a small blip in what is the big picture. He came back rather quickly. And
it's I think once you've been training long enough, I mean, you definitely, those neurological adaptations are the first things to go, but you don't lose as much muscle as you think, surprisingly. So, so moving on, can you explain this? When designing a program, volume starts high and intensity down, then volume goes down as intensity rises. Since hypertrophy is related to volume, how do you program for bodybuilding purposes if your volume is going up or going down instead of up? This was actually one of my favorite questions that was asked, because when I first started sort of learning about programming and the importance of training volume, you see the typical sort of linear periodization model where volume starts higher and intensity goes up as volume tapers down, and you think, okay, well, if I'm trying to increase volume over time, it seems like I'm heading in the wrong direction. So a couple of things here. I think the biggest thing, you're definitely correct. I mean, a typical strength peaking phase, volume's going to start high, build up work capacity, some general hypertrophy, and then intensity is going to go up. And eventually you're going to want to taper volume down to accommodate for that increased intensity. So you're not running a program that looks like a small lob, in those later phases if you don't have to. So, so the other thing, I think people tend to think if volume needs to go up over time, they expect it to look like a linear trip, to that destination. And so you're not going to be increasing volume at all times. And so you might, start up with volume, taper down, and then the next time you ramp up with volume, you might go just a little bit higher. And so you want to think of volume more on a macro cycle, meet to meet, year to year basis, even more so than I would say month to month. I mean, there's some months where you might be a little bit lower depending on if you're transitioning off of a meet and you're trying to sort of resensitize yourself to that volume stimulus, which I think is important to spend some time during the year to recover, and also to allow your body to return to that volume and get something out of it, because you don't want to constantly be adding volume over the span of a year, but more looking at it with a wider lens, year to year, and you're going to, you're going to be getting stronger, so even if you're doing the same sets and reps, you're probably still going to be accumulating more volume. And going back to, I think, the first question, if you're still making progress, then you don't really need to be actively adding more and more aggressively. I think that the volume progression is subtle and sometimes even goes unnoticed for some people.
So I think we sometimes underestimate just how practical of a way of adding volume to your training is to just simply get stronger. I think my first taper, incidental tapers, I ran Max OT. Remember Max OT?
Yeah.
You kids probably don't remember Max OT, but it was a complete, typical, 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 12 bodybuilder, did Max OT, and then it was quite insane, especially at that time. I was an early intermediate, what it did to my 3 sets of 10 once I went back to that. So it's definitely, and I think that's the issue with a lot of the bodybuilders, they're kind of afraid to leave that volume since they hear so often that volume is such an important component to get jacked. They're afraid to leave it for a few weeks, a few months, but like you said, they have to look at the big picture.
Yeah, and usually when you decrease volume, intensity comes up. Yeah, like you said, you do get stronger, and then your next volume block, oftentimes you don't really have to change anything in terms of the protocol. It's not like you're going to be adding a set every single time you enter another volume block. So hopefully that answers that. The best way to prevent SI joint injuries during overreaching cycles. My squat and deadlift form is getting worse. How do you perform these lifts safely, although you might be exhausted? Let you kick this one up.
Well, I think I don't think everyone needs to overreach. I think that's if you can progress without feeling like crap, I think enjoy it as long as you can. And then also, I would say make sure it's professionally diagnosed, because ever since I've shared with people that I have this issue with my SI joint that kind of comes and goes. Everyone seems to have an SI joint injury, and the thing with that area, it's especially if you haven't had it diagnosed, it's really hard to pinpoint what exactly is happening. Initially, I honestly thought it was sciatica. The SI joint caused sciatica, but I had that professionally diagnosed, and I would say for me, just in my situation, again, everyone's going to be a bit different. The biggest thing is to get my glutes back in line, as that seems to be the number one cause. I would get sleepy glutes, and it can be for a number of things. Typically, it's just because I'm sitting down way too much. But yeah, make sure that's what it is, and then see a professional. And don't ask me, because I really don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. And one thing, I've had athletes that are dealing with SI joint issues, and getting your glutes in line, and then I think just waking them up when you're actually doing squats. I mean, and I sort of discovered this with my groin strain. I was able to squat pain free when I had one of the hip circles. I think Mark Bell sells those, the slingshot hip circles, and it forced me to abduct my legs out and actually activate my glutes a little bit and cue my glutes more. And so warming up with that, I've noticed with other athletes has helped with pain acutely anyway.
Yeah, and sleepy glutes are an issue now, I think, because people are either training or sitting down, it seems like. But yeah, glutes, I think at some point almost everyone's going to run into issues with them. But yeah, SI joint, make sure that's what it is, because I think I get it at least once a week now.
All right. If you're planning on having a long off season, is it better to slowly gain weight and then hang out around a reasonable top end weight for a long time, or is it better to get to that top end weight, do a mini cut, and then slowly bulk up to the top end weight again and repeat once you reach that, and repeat the process? I think a lot of this is sort of dependent on behavior too. I think a lot of people, a good example is this is just right after a show, and exiting that deficit. And I know there's, reverse dieting is one method. Other people like to kind of get their body fat back so they just feel whole again. And I think there's some merit to that, at least in terms of reversing those metabolic adaptations. But I think the more optimal way is to do it slowly, and allow yourself to slowly increase your training intensity, so to speak, and from there you're just kind of gradually adding food, and then once you put on that body fat, reverse some of those major adaptations, you can then do a mini cut. And I think that's what I would suggest for most people, and I think you're going to get, the rate of lean tissue gain is much slower than that of fat. And so if you can mitigate the amount of fat and the rate you're gaining body fat, the less you're going to have to strip off for each unit of muscle gain, so to speak.
And I think another big thing is how much time do you have? I think sometimes I'll get an athlete that, in order to say keep their pro card, they have to compete within a year's time. So for that athlete, maybe we might want to keep it a bit closer. If you're, say, the exact opposite, you have all the time in the world, there's no specific time or deadline that you have to be back on stage, you're really young, then perhaps in that case it'd be worth getting a little heavier. So I think it's timeline dependent, it's training aids dependent, and then also it kind of varies from person to person. Some people like looking the part, whereas other people are just like,
and that can mean being lean or actually looking like you lift with a shirt on. So that's got actual different implications depending.
So it's very context based, but yeah, I think there's really no right or wrong, other than I do think that it really depends on your timeline more than anything else.
Let's see. cutting down weight, do you still keep your routine, your powerlifting routine, even though you might lose strength, or do you switch it up? I think, well, first of all, there's not really a powerlifting routine, so to speak. I think what you're getting at is, do you still focus on progressing those lifts, even though you might not be progressing those lifts? And I think with retaining lean mass, the intent to retain that strength needs to be there, and maintaining those as much strength as you can in those high tension rep ranges is going to go a long way in terms of retaining actual muscle tissue. I think you're going to lose some endurance for sure. You're going to be depleted glycogen, but one thing that you do kind of have in your control is maintaining, as best as you can, that low to moderate rep strength. It is going to go down, but usually it's more because of changes in leverages more so than losses in muscle tissue.
And often you see this all the time. An athlete actually starts their diet, and in the first few weeks you actually progress.
Yeah.
And I think that should be your goals when you do start your diet. To progress as long as you can, because there will be a point where you kind of backtrack a little bit, and hopefully, because you increase your lifts just a tiny bit initially, when we do actually start coming back down, we're not left with too big of a deficit to come back from once the diet is over. So yeah, nothing that big should change. You probably there will be a point where you can't tolerate as much volume, but that's just because you're not eating as much. But your basic training, whatever you use in the off season, should be something you can still use when you're in your diet phase. And
personally, like if I switch somebody over to a fat loss phase at the beginning, to kick off a prep, I'm not going to immediately cut their volume either. I mean, I sort of cut volume dependent on if I see the need to cut volume. I mean, volume is one way to cause overload, and so if the weight on the bar is going down and we can still keep the volume in place, you're still going to have the stimulus there, but at the same time, once there's limited substrate around it, it definitely can become an issue with recovery, and then you have to scale volume back. So changing gears a little bit, how do people somehow calculate macros accurately when eating out? For example, a lot of YouTubers incorporate Chipotle in their diet. Ogus even incorporated it for his contest prep. You can eat out, and I'm convinced Berto doesn't actually have good macros. I think because I never see him eat, so I think he's actually got the poverty macros, and he's just fooling everybody. But honestly, for a prep, I tell people to avoid it just because it's the one time where I think the predictability that can be had by really tightening the screws in terms of controlling your intake can be very beneficial. In an off season, I eat out a lot, and so one of the things that I do is obviously there's nutritional data online. It's more often than not going to be accurate. Yeah. So I mean, if you're in a fat loss phase and you're eating out, kind of a nice buffer that I do is maybe add 5 to 10% to the fat number, for example. Give yourself a little bit of wiggle room there, because at the end of the day, the cooks don't care that you're counting macros. They just want to finish their shift and go home. So that's typically the case. But
yeah, I agree with that. If you're prepping, the one thing about flexible dieting is that it all comes down to that bottom line. Like every 90% of what I adjust when I'm dieting, the dynamic part of my diet is to make me better. And I don't think eating Chipotle 2-3 times a week when you could have gone home and had a very accurate meal is really being bottom line conscious. Yeah. And then also One thing about flexible dieting is that it should help you, yes, when these situations come up. You know, if it's your anniversary, if it's an important birthday, it's kind of nice to have that option where, you know, I'm going to kind of overestimate this meal, enjoy it with my peeps, but don't go looking for that intentionally. I just don't think, I've yet to personally see, because Matt will tell you himself that he probably could have gotten a smidge leaner during any of his contest preps. I've yet to see anyone who's done that routinely who's come in the right shape. So.
And I think the other strategy is that if you do, you know, if you have an anniversary or a business meeting, something like that, when you go out, don't go out with the intent of, oh, this restaurant has their nutritional facts online, I'm just going to get whatever I want and work it in. Go with things that are hard to screw up. Like things like, for example, my last prep, I think I went out to eat 3 to 4 times, and I think they were all at the same restaurant, just this local steakhouse. I would get like a 10-ounce sirloin with no butter on it, and you know, maybe it's off an ounce, ounce and a half, but at the end of the day, you know, we're talking 60, 70 calories, and so we're not thinking, okay, how much oil.
All right, so on the last one, bottom line, if you're prepping and you want to look good, don't eat out. Right out of memory on that. So let's get that last one in. I think this one is, for those of you who don't know Brian, a little bit of his history, I think this would be a good one to end it on. So what are the top 3 things you wish you knew when you began lifting?
There's more than 3. I think the biggest thing is milk as much progress as you can out of each amount of volume. I think a lot of people that have these high volume thresholds they need to go beyond to make progress. It's possible, but not always the case. But it's possible maybe they just started too aggressively early in their career. There's actually another question that sort of ties into this. They were talking about Jeff and the progress that he's made, and you can probably speak to this more than I can, but that dude's like the king of milking what he can out of a program, and the patience there. So I mean, that's total opposite of what a lot of people do, but I would think over his training career, he's still
kept him healthier.
Yeah. So there's something that can be said about that. So I think milking as much progress you can over time, you know, with a given amount of workload. Second one, more dealing with nutrition, and I think this is less vogue now than it was when I started lifting, but that you don't have to eat protein every 2.5 to 3 hours, and it's an embarrassing but funny story. I once had a job working with some carpenters over a summer, and I remember I would be really stressed out because I would wake up 6 a.m., be there at 7. I would eat as soon as I woke up, so I didn't go catabolic. And I think our lunch break was at noon, and I was trying to get every 2 hours get a meal in, or 2.5 hours get a meal in. But the lunch break never fell within that window of time, so I would actually, that summer, I had consumed 8 cans of tuna in a porta potty. And it's absolutely ridiculous, but that happened, and it's one of those things that once you realize that type of stuff's not important, it's very liberating, and you can look back at it and laugh. But finding an eating pattern that fits your schedule, and I think looking back, those are sort of some fond memories, and it's sort of the romance of the whole situation of actually thinking that stuff's optimal, and it's a learning experience you can kind of chuckle at, but it's embarrassing as well. So it's pretty good reason not to have to eat every 2.5 hours. Third thing I think is just enjoy the progress early on. I think a lot of people, they see that end goal and they want to get there quickly. And if you're discouraged from the gains you're making out of the gate, it's only going to get worse. It's a depressing thought, but you're not going to put on more muscle at any time in your training career than you do in that first year. And so if you're impatient in that first year, you're not, stopping to smell the roses, so to speak, you're going to be in for a rude awakening when you're, a decade plus into your training career, and you're, assuming, if you're training under a natural environment, you're looking at 1 to 3 pounds a year type of thing, and that's
a good year.
Yeah, that's a good year. So fall in love with the process more than the outcome, I think, is important, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. I've always enjoyed training, and that's not true for a lot of people. I think a lot of people start out and out of the gate, they hate training, and then they end up falling in love with it. But use that progress out of the gate to build momentum and not discourage you, I think, is the biggest thing. Because like I said, I'm 50 years old. I'm hoping to, Marshall Johnson's a great bodybuilder, but he probably built most of his muscle
Early on.
25 years ago. So but he's a badass now. So anyway.
Let's see how much time we have left.
Do we sign off? We have about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Perfect. I have to edit that one out.
Oh, no, we're good.
Okay.
I know right away. I think I would have loved to have had maybe some guidance, some coaching early on, but mostly from the strength side of things. I think had I learned to deadlift, squat, bench press, just the basic movements like early on, I think I would have been in a much better place, a healthier place for sure. And then counted calories. I did not count a single calorie until my 8th year of weightlifting. I just ate clean and had tuna and porta potties every so often. So those two, and then I would say the last one would be probably comparing myself to others. So it kind of ties in with yours. I was looking at everyone else, how they were progressing, or Ronnie Coleman or something, and looking at, again, like skipping through on the process, which to me now is like the best part. I mean, this is in many ways like the best part of my day, and this is going on my 15th year. So yeah, those are probably the 2 things. The 3 things rather, but
it kind of, you mentioned counting calories, and that can certainly help optimize some things. But at the same time, as people become more aware of the importance of tracking their nutrition, you almost see the pendulum is swung in the opposite direction. So you see people that are 14 years old.
I'm in college and I can't track macros. I shouldn't go to college.
So, or you'll see people that are 14, 15 that are obsessing over hitting macros, and they're not. Some of them aren't enjoying their youth, and you want to, the years where you're growing, it's like you want to get away with what you can. And so for me, I would hesitate to assign macros to somebody that's that young, just because they can make progress without it. But I would give them sort of guidelines to go off of. Maybe give them a protein goal, and or a rough